We're going to do Q&A, and Martha is going to come up and make a few announcements.
Card. I'm directing you to two groups. One is the Sane Energy Project. Trade Unions for Energy Democracy. I've made a note of how you can get onto their website as well. This is Sean's organization. It's a great organization, lots and lots of resources, lots of stuff about workers and communities all around the globe. And finally, as you will have noted from Kim's talk, and we're moving to a new stage. We've been through writing letters and making phone calls and marching and making signs and all the rest of it, and that all has to continue. But we're now at the stage of civil disobedience, which is called these days direct action. I'm very old-fashioned. And wherever you're getting civil disobedience, you have the need for a legal defense fund. Kim mentioned Marty Stoller. Many of us from Brooklyn for Peace know Marty Stoller because he was there on the front lines right after 9/11, helping to get people out of jail, all the Muslims, the Arabs who were being lifted right off the streets and thrown into solitary confinement. Marty Stoller was there. He was with Justice for Detainees. We all know him. He's great. So that's my pitch, and I'm going to turn it back to Betta and the Q&A.
Yeah, well, the drilling is only one small part of the process of fracking. I mean, we went through that story of the banner, the United States of Fracking, so it's not just the drilling, which is the only thing that was banned here, the high volume hydraulic fracturing. There's still vertical drilling. There's 6,000 vertical wells being drilled in New York State right now.
Those are much safer, aren't they?
No, energy extractive processes is not safe for anybody. You know, all the pipelines, the compressor stations, the power plants, the LNG ports, the chemicals, the frac sand mining, the water withdrawal from our rivers. You know, this is all part of the process, but that hasn't been what's banned. And there's a big movement. A lot of the folks that were working on fighting the fracking, the drilling, are now, you know, luckily moving on to understanding that the process is all connected to the infrastructure. Like, Sane Energy Project was like right there in New York City being like, shut this pipeline down, and trying to appeal to the greater anti-fracking movement. Like, it's about the infrastructure, and you know, we're finally there now that we, you know, it takes a long time to build this movement of understanding. You still have to try to explain to somebody, like, compressor stations, as I was saying, is like, it's a really unsexy conversation to have, but we have to figure out a way to make it sexy and make people want to talk about it, because it's killing life on the planet.
Well, and I just want to chime in also that Governor Cuomo had jurisdiction over fracking, but many of these projects, as Kim pointed out, are under FERC, which is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And so now a lot of our energy is being, no pun intended, shifted to focus on FERC and at the federal level. As Kim also pointed out, Governor Cuomo recently called on FERC to halt the construction of this AIM pipeline, and the company Spectra basically said no.
We've all been anti-fracking, but is the real fight anti-gas? Any gas, like we should not be
Anti-fossil fuels.
Yeah.
And nuclear.
Anti-extractive energy.
Yeah.
Nuclear is extractive energy. You know, fossil fuels are extractive energy. We've watched, I mean, life on this planet has coexisted in harmony way before we were even here with the power of the sun. I mean, there's ways to do it. We can do it.
You have a question?
Do you think, given the state of like oil prices and the crash and some of these towns where that's been a major industry are going bust and workers are losing their jobs, do you see this as a possible opportunity to push forward, united with these workers around like a just transition, green job program, something like that?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Is this an opportunity, the price is falling, to make alliances with the workers in the industry? I think this is very much so. This was Naomi Klein's message in Paris as well. She was referring to the Alberta tar sands where 60,000 workers have lost their job in the province, not just on the tar sands, but there's so many knock-on, induced and secondary jobs related to the tar sands. And the same is true in the US as well, because even if we look, even if we take away from the statistics of the latest price pool, if we look at coal in the United States, in 1945 there was something like 350,000 coal miners, and they were nearly all of them were in a union. And now there's about 70,000, of which 10% are in a union, if they're lucky, and the average coal miner produces more coal now than, let me rephrase that, more coal is produced in the United States today than was produced in 1945. So the actual capital, it's capital intensive, it's no longer traditional coal mining, it's blasting. But in the, in terms of the fracking in gas and in tar sands, workers are being expunged from the whole fossil fuel sector. And yes, I think this is a time to say, let's have a turn in direction. I just did a piece, a bit promotional, self-promotional here, called Labour After Keystone XL, which is coming out in about a month in the New Labour Forum. It says this is a chance now for the labour movement to finally dump its alliance with the American petroleum industry. The building trades have got literally an on paper, signed with blood alliance with the petroleum industry to promote North American fossil fuels. And those workers are now with the Keystone defeat. There are many in the building trades who are fighting for a different direction. So I think there's a good opening there, definitely. Thanks for your question. Yeah, let me just give an example from the trade union discussions at the global level. Around about 2006, 2007, all union leaders started talking about green growth, green and inclusive growth. We need green growth. And that term comes from the World Bank. They didn't know that. They just been basically, that was the dominant sort of language. Everybody's using it, policymakers are using it, elected officials are using it. Those are the good guys, and let alone the fossil fuel guys, the carbon criminals. They're using a completely different language. So I think all my suggestion would be that we should all just be careful about what words we use and where did it come from and what agenda is being served, or maybe it's not an agenda. But I think having that kind of more critical approach to formulations. I've heard people talk about, we need to tax carbon. I've seen everybody's heads nod. It's like, well, what's that? What does that actually mean? We could have a whole discussion on taxing carbon. Are we going to be, if the tax is then passed on to the consumer, which are mostly working class people, then who's getting taxed? The polluter pays principle. It's the worker pays principle often, because if the polluter has to pay, then that gets passed on. And in the end, we don't get to the fundamental problem of who owns and controls energy, resources, infrastructure, and options. And I think that's got to be the heart of the energy democracy debate, is we got to go after that in a big, big way. Not in a slogan way, but in a way that says, this is a future we can build. These are the terms and language we can use to inspire people. But I think using terms like stranded assets, just my view.
Yes. And how do we change the language or possibilities of the workers being included in the different economies?
We want to take a few questions, and then because otherwise it's going to be too much.
Okay, we'll take a few questions.
Sean, I appreciated what you were saying about the analogy to the rapid electrification of this country. That happened in the context of labor unrest and mass exercise of sabotage power on the economy, unlike anything we've seen since. And I wonder, from your dual perspective, do you see pathways towards momentum on that scale in either the labor movement or in the environmental movement?
And who is the person over here who is like desperate for a question? Yes. We want to hear from you. Sorry.
Yeah, this one's for Sean. You did a really awesome job talking about making the distinction between a soft energy democracy and a hard energy democracy, and talking about the limitations of a soft energy democracy, like the weakness of pursuing decentralization as an end goal in itself. I was wondering if you could go into a bit more detail as to what a hard energy democracy would entail and what differentiates it from something.
Sean talked about the Paris Agreement as a business as usual agreement. And I sometimes get the feeling that advocates of energy democracy are making a similar assumption, that we'll just plug in renewable energy and then proceed with business as usual. But all of the projections that I've seen, even the most optimistic ones about a sustainable future, say that renewable energy has to be combined with significant reductions in consumption. So obviously we can't proceed with business as usual.
I think there's a lot of overlap in terms of engaging workers. How do we do that? My sense is that you mentioned just transition in front of a union. The idea of just transition is that workers should not have to suffer a disproportionate burden for environmental or climate policy. That the burden should be, the opportunities should be shared, and the risks and the burden should be shared. That's the kind of the idea. But just because you work in fossil fuels doesn't mean to say you're the one who gets thrown under the decarbonized truck, right? So I think so how do we engage unions on this? Many unions understand that the way the political system is rigged and the power of the fossil fuel companies, that they've made a pact with the devil even though they know it's the devil, because they don't have any confidence that the liberal policy architecture that's being proposed is actually going to deliver anything resembling a just transition for them. Of course, you can point to the fact, well, you're being thrown out of jobs because of the collapse in the prices. True. But when a job comes along, like building a pipeline, and you've got members, basically screaming, probably wearing Donald Trump bumper stickers that they want to build that pipeline, a union leader in that business often won't last more than 5 minutes unless they try to sign a project labor agreement with the company to do it. They often argue, and have argued in front of me and many other people, I'm sure, in this room, that if we don't build it, someone else is going to build it, it's inevitable, we can't stop it. This was the argument with the Keystone Pipeline. So I think, but engaging on the, it's not easy, but I would say that there are many other workers now in healthcare and transport in particular who are taking up climate fights and are putting up with a lot of abuse from the building trades. I don't have time to go into details, but there's a war going on. Labor is a carbon battleground. And this is true not just in the US but elsewhere. And to engage workers in the industry, I think, is only on the basis of having an alternative, and this is where democratic control of energy, making sure that, let's say, new public authorities doing municipal renewable power, hire union, work union, invite unions into the policy design phase, get workers' organizations in at the very beginning. And I think that will go some way towards neutralizing the opposition. It may not solve all the problems. So I'll just transition into the question of, is it Patrick? Was it Patrick? Is that you, Patrick? Yeah. On the, yes, the context of the New Deal, of course, was an economic depression and a rising movement. But it was interesting that and I think there's signs that we're in a similar period. We don't have the levels of economic hardship that we had in the 30s. We don't have the levels of unemployment. But we certainly have volatility at the level of politics that I don't think anybody, I certainly haven't seen in my 30 years living in the United States. I haven't seen anything like a Bernie Sanders versus Trump phenomenon happening. I just haven't seen it. Where a guy gets up and he talks about socialism and literally millions of young people in particular are voting for the guy. I don't want to exaggerate it, but this is an opportunity, I think, to build a movement. Climate on its own, energy won't build a movement on its own, but it has to be part of a program, a vision of a different society and a different future. And so I do feel that I think the electoral space is very important. I think it's very difficult at the national level, yes, but I think with city and state level, I think left wing, whether I would like to think they were independent of both the main parties, could implement policies at the state level to really radically scale up renewable energy in the public sphere, publicly owned. I think that's a possibility. It won't overthrow capitalism, but it will do a lot to build confidence in workers' organizations, in community power, in the same way as we take the struggle to them, and I think that's important. The American Federation of Labor in 1932 approached the Roosevelt administration when he was first elected and said, we want to do this in the public sector, public goods and public works schemes. And this was like, the AFL was a pretty backward organization then, just as backward now, some people would say. But you know, what was interesting about that whole discourse was that when FDR, when the Rural Electrification Administration started, they said, well, we can either do private contractors or we can do it in-house, which is the best way of doing it. And they said, we'll do it in-house. And the Tennessee Valley Authority was the first place where public sector unions were actually organized in the United States. The door was open for them. So these are the kind of, I think, unions in the trades, they want to see big scale stuff. That's why they like centralized as opposed to decentralized. Doesn't mean to say per se there's anything particularly bad in my view about centralized. Under some circumstances you may need it. But the reason why unions like centralized, because it usually means an employer and it usually means an agreement, whereas decentralized is residential, it's often non-union, it's some kind of some cowboy kind of installer with some middleman doing the financing, and before you know it, there's no room for unions in that scenario or workers, and there's no room even for communities to some extent. So I think the lesson of Germany is saying enough of this, let's go into remunicipalization, take back the grids from private companies is really important. I don't know if I dealt with everything, but Steve's question, if I may, 1 more minute, would that be all right?
Please.
You know, I think this ties into the hard energy democracy. You know, I'd like to see a day when a president of the United States will stand up and say, given the assault on our atmosphere by the fossil fuel companies and the assault on people, millions of people around the world who are dying, and thousands, tens of thousands of people are dying through illnesses related to fossil fuels. I am passing through an executive order by using my executive authority to immediately freeze the assets of all the major fossil fuel corporations. Now, how many people would come out in the streets protesting that move? You might get some. And there may be all sorts of legalities involved around the Constitution. But my interpretation of the Constitution, it says without just cause. Well, I think there is a just cause. And a brave party, a movement, a leader, whatever is pushed forward from that movement should use all sorts of powers available to them. This is, I think, possible. And I would definitely go after the fossil fuel companies. Seizing their assets is a good place to start. And then, of course, financing public renewable power, using pension funds the unions have got for the guaranteed rate of return, which wouldn't need to be very high given today's interest rates. It's possible to do that and to go big with it, because the scale that we need to be at of renewable power, look at renewable power in the United States. What is it as a percentage of power generation? Does anybody know? Take hydro out of the picture, what have we got? 2%? 2%? It's 75% fossil fuel, 20% nuclear, of 6 or 7% big hydro, and 1 or 2% wind and solar. That's not going to get us to well below 2 degrees if the United States is going to play its role, which it should do, given that 28% of emissions in the atmosphere came from 5% of the world's population, the United States. I'm not talking about annual emissions, I'm talking about cumulative emissions, which is warming the planet now. We need that level of ambition, and that's the only way I think we're going to do it, is go straight after the culprits, scale up renewable power in the public sector, bring communities and municipalities in, bring representatives of those organizations in to the transition. And when Bernie Sanders says we need to accelerate the transition to clean and renewable energy, but then he puts forward incremental steps, he's not doing, we need to be talking to every Bernie Sanders supporter and saying, we like what Bernie's saying about climate change, we like what he's saying about taking on the fossil fuel companies, but we really need to do some work on this energy transition idea, because a few little tax breaks for a few little solar companies is not going to get us where we need to go. So I end my second presentation.
Thank you. Well, and if I may promote a march that's happening this summer, July 24th in Philadelphia, a march for clean energy just before the Democratic convention. There's going to be buses going down to New York from New York City to Philly, and would love to see all of you there in the streets calling for bold action.
If you look up the United States of Fracking banner, you'll find the Facebook page, and if you go to the Beyond Extreme Energy website, they have like a little drop down for it. Yeah.
We can also share it on the Brooklyn for Peace Facebook page.
Okay, great. Yeah, but it's not copyrighted. It's for all of us, and this is how it should be, right?
I just had a quick follow.
It's estimated IMF figures 500 billion a year annually globally for fossil fuel companies. Take that off, I don't know what effect it would have. I'm sure that's a lot of money. And I'm not playing devil's advocate here, but what fossil fuel companies say is per unit of energy produced, they're far, far less subsidized than renewable energy, which is actually true. But who cares? I mean, that's not the point. I don't know the economic impact of what it will be, but clearly it's an important demand, and I think it's one that we should take up without any illusions, though, that 500 billion. I think one of the issues around the divestment movement as well is there's a bit of a myth that if money goes out of fossil fuels in the form of investment, it's going to end up in renewable energy. That's not true. What's happening globally, and you see this in the European Union, money is flying out of the energy system because the value of the utilities in Europe, mostly driven by fossil fuels, has gone down by €1 trillion, right? So it's now half of where it was 10 years ago. But that doesn't mean that €1 trillion that flew out of there is running into renewable energy. It's just big institutional investors, they go wherever they can make money. So they're not going to say, oh, now we've got to do renewables now. No, what's happening is investments flying out of renewables as well. So investment in renewable power in the European Union, because of the failure of the carbon market, has gone down by about €50 billion from 2012 to 2015 a year. So it's now gone down 3 years in a row. And so both sides of the energy system, if you like, the fossil and the renewable, is in a crisis. And the same is happening in the United States. People getting out of fossil fuels because of low prices, low profitability, aging infrastructure, the coal power plants are really old, the nuclear are getting old. This means that investors are not going anywhere near it, and companies are basically going out of business or going somewhere else. This doesn't help renewables. It doesn't help renewables.
Okay, this woman has had her hand up for a minute, so let's make this the last question.
My question is, do you have a success story to share with, an example of a community that has taken back their power in a really successful way? And also, is there a movement that is specifically dedicated to that idea, not just of stopping different industries, but also building their own, alternative system?
There's a fantastic group based in Rosendale called Citizens for Local Power. You can check out their website, and they're working on a model called community choice aggregation, which is not necessarily what Sean's proposing, which is the wholesale takeover, public takeover of the utilities, but it's a step in that direction. The utilities maintain the control of transmission and distribution, but the CCA, community choice aggregation, gets to decide where the energy is coming from, gets to do local generation, long-term planning. There's a CCA in California, Sonoma Clean Power, that's doing amazing work to really create their own energy system based on clean energy, energy efficiency investment. And so Citizens for Local Power is modeling their CCA in Ulster County off of that. So that is one example that I would look into.
There's also our local friends from Uprose and that have helped to actually transform their entire waterfront, because they stuck their heels in the ground and had pushed for being a part of not letting, you know, giant energy come in and just plant itself in Sunset Park. I wouldn't be the right person to explain everything that they did, but it's something that Uprose is a great organization that we really admire. And they've been very successful in Brooklyn. And yeah, there's something to look into. There's a lot of success stories that there was, you know, people fought really hard in Painted Post, New York. Recently, just one that Shell Oil was coming in and withdrawing 1 million gallons of water a day from their rivers, and they stopped them. A very small local community on the in the southern tier from taking that over the border to frack. I mean, there's lots of success stories of people just sticking their heels in the ground and saying no. And once we teach people that that is the way to change, we make that the popular consensus, we're going to be able to show people that sticking our heels in the ground and saying no is not a scary thing to do. We may get arrested doing it because we're trying to break the system that isn't working for us. So breaking the system is going to be a hard job, but if you're willing to see it through, we can actually rebuild it to make it work for us.
Okay, one example from David about municipalization, then the last question, I promise.
For those of you who were around in the late 1970s in Long Island, there was a desire to build a nuclear power plant in a place called Truro. That was advanced by a private utility company called Lilco. Many of us were very involved in that struggle. I'm sitting next to I was involved. And what we decided, the way to stop Lilco was to municipalize the Long Island power distribution. And by the way, that worked. There is no nuclear power plant that has ever operated in Truro. They ran the tests, but they never got the power plant up and running. So the answer is yes, there is a way that you can use municipalization to actually have some control over your energy. And the story of LIPA, the Long Island Power Authority, is a good one that lets us know that the struggle is never over.
All right, good